Thank you for coming this morning. We're going to try to get started on time. Just a bit of a switch because we're going to have to end a little bit earlier than we originally hoped. My name is Justin Peters. I'm an editor at the Columbia Journalism Review in New York. This is the second of 4 panels I'm leading this week at the International Journalism Festival on the broad topic of how to do good journalism when all the odds are against you. It's a question that's on a lot of our minds these days, I think, because more and more it feels like the odds are against us. There are not as many resources as there once were to fund the work that we do as journalists. There seems to be an increasing pressure to do more work with less time and money, and a general sense of hastiness and sort of fear about how to succeed in this current environment and what will happen when we move towards the future. It sort of pervades many newsrooms, I think. And the specific topic of the panel today, we're going to be talking about business models, specifically how to get beyond advertising. In the beginning of this year in January, the American magazine The Atlantic published a sort of interesting advertisement for the Church of Scientology. For those of you who don't know, the Church of Scientology is a rather controversial religion in the United States. A lot of people like to call it a cult and sort of question its policies of ruthlessly attacking all those who would criticize it. But they ran an ad on the Atlantic's website, and the ad was notable because it looked very much like a typical article in the Atlantic. This is called native advertising. It's sort of the latest trend in online ads, and native advertising is a euphemism for advertising that attempts to fool the reader into thinking that it is an actual piece of editorial content instead of something that has been wholly created by a corporation or interest group. The Church of Scientology's whole point for partnering with the Atlantic was then to fool readers into thinking that this august, much respected magazine was printing a fairly laudatory article about this controversial church and thus benefit from the positive associations that readers had with this well-respected brand. It didn't work. Everyone noticed what they were doing in the Atlantic, quite quickly took the advertisement down, but it was up long enough to, I think, do a bit of damage to the Atlantic as a media property, and also to sort of deliver some lessons for those of us who like to watch trends in the media and sort of try to look at what's happening now and what they might tell us about what's coming next. And though native advertising is the newest sort of trend or fad or what you might call it in advertising, it's just sort of the latest in a long line of things that people have tried as they've attempted to monetize content online. And, anyone who's been to a website at any point over the last 20 years can name the various types of online advertisement, the banner ad, sort of inline advertising, pre-roll advertising. I could go on and on and on, but sort of the general sort of one of the connecting threads from all of these types of advertising, and I think they all sort of serve, like the native advertising does, to degrade an editorial brand, to degrade content. Perhaps I'm being a bit too harsh by saying that, but I think there's definitely a sort of a feeling that in order to make money by advertising online, you need to produce more and more content to produce more and more ad impressions, and thus that encourages people to produce the sort of quick hit, uninspired writing that seems to characterize so much of what we see on the internet. Now, this isn't a new problem. editorial and business have been in tension for as long as department stores have been advertising their dry goods sales in printed newspapers. The difference now is that we're on the internet, right? We are 20 years into the history of news online, and though much has changed over those past 20 years in terms of the sort of content we produce, how we present and distribute it, how we fund that content has stayed essentially the same. We are still primarily relying, most places, on selling ads against written or visual work. And it seems to me that the same amount of thought and innovation that we're putting into what to produce, how to produce and distribute it, we need to put into how to fund that content. Now, as I'm saying that, I'm realizing we do put a lot of thought into that. And the four panelists I have with me today are going to talk about some of the things that people have come up with in their attempts to find other ways to fund journalism in the digital age and diversify revenue streams. And since I am by far the least interesting person at this table, I will shut up and turn it over to the four men sitting with me here. From my left, we have Garrett Goodman, who is the Director of International Business Development at Worldcrunch. We have Wilfried Ruetten, who is the Director of the European Journalism Center. To his right, we have Gabriel Kahn, who is the co-director of the Media, Economics, and Entrepreneurship Lab at the University of Southern California. And last but certainly not least, we have Marco Bardazzi, who is the digital editor for La Stampa in Torino. Marco, I'll start with you, I guess. La Stampa has been around for many years, but sort of as of late, it has also sort of developed a bit of a reputation as being one of the more innovative Italian dailies. And I guess I was hoping you might be able to set this stage a little bit and talk about the challenges that you have faced and your colleagues have faced in trying to come up with, be as innovative with ways to fund the journalism you're doing as you are in coming up with ways to produce and present it.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I was thinking of speaking in Italian, but since you don't have headphones, I'll try to go with English. Otherwise, it's difficult to have a discussion. I belong to what in the US you call the legacy media. So basically, it's the old media, the traditional media. I work for a 150 years old newspaper, which at this point is not even just a newspaper. It's a multimedia news organization. The challenges, as Justin was saying, the challenges are a lot. I mean, trying to change the business model, but also the culture of a traditional news organization is not easy. Many times we think that could be easier to start just starting from scratch and doing everything completely new. But as a second thought, we think we have something more important to offer as legacy media, which is still probably it's the usual word, but it's content. Content is still king for us. We have seen this during, for example, this political season, very complex political season that we have right now in Italy. We have seen how readers and users are looking for quality content on the web. They are also looking for, let's say, brands. They are still looking for news that have that particular brand that could be in Italy, for example, Corriere della Sera, La Repubblica, or La Stampa, in my case. because there is need for what I would call quality journalism, even if quality journalism is available also in many other places, not just in legacy media. What we are trying to do, basically, and what we have done in the past 2 years, is to reorganize our newsroom in a way that we can work as a multi-platform news organization, in a way making it easier as possible to move content from one platform to another, in order not to have, just the paper organization going in one direction and the digital one in another. We are trying to integrate as more as we can our production, but what is important for us is really to make easier for content to move. When content when content is free to move from one platform to another, you have a lot of opportunities in this market. And you can start thinking about new business model. I would lie if I would say that, okay, advertisement is no more the key, the root of our business model, because it's still there, and advertisement is important. It's a key business for us, as well as subscriptions. But there are a few things that we are trying to do differently from what we were used to do in the past. For example, we have working a lot on, ebooks, which have become easy to create, easy to produce, just because content is free to move from one platform to another, digital content. And so when you have digital content available and you have the right editorial system, you have the right organization, you can use that content in a different way and trying to produce, for example, an instant ebook that can tell the story in an interesting way for just, let's say, 1.99 euros. And we have seen that this is working very well. I mean, the ebooks that we have proposed in the past few months have been at the top of the list for on the Apple Store or on Amazon immediately. The market is small, the money you make is small, but yet it's a beginning. It's a beginning, and on this, like many other things, I think that the key word right now is contamination for us. I don't know if it's fine in English. I mean, how does it sound in English? But contamination can have a good sound if you think of that as the possibility for us to open the newsroom to new ideas, but also to new professionalities. I mean, we are working with engineers right now. We are working with graphic designers. We are working with people that don't have journalism as their key business. And it's very important for us because we develop new ideas and we find new ways of proposing our content. We are selling content, selling rights of our content, and Worldcrunch will say something more about this since we also work with them. We are proposing apps, several apps of different kind. For now, they are for free, but we see an interesting market in apps because there are several applications that you can develop with quality journalism content that could have some kind of value. And then, I mean, I'll try to be quick so we can discuss, but there are several other things that we can dig on this. And then, I mean, we are open to discuss with everybody that could have a say in the way in which we do our job. And I cannot, and I have to mention here, for example, Google. Because every time we talk about Google, it's like it's the enemy of the time. So we have worked with Google, for example, during the political campaign. We have organized hangouts with the candidates. We have given readers the possibility to ask questions directly to the candidates. And with Google, we have found an interesting way of working together. So why not to try something more? There is something interesting, I guess, that we should know about the way in which Google is managing news right now, even if this has to do a lot with advertisement, and this morning we are trying to see how we can go beyond advertisement. But Google is developing algorithms that are giving legacy media more visibility than others. So you can say, this is a shame. It's not right. From my point of view, it's really interesting because I have seen some stories about how they are doing this, and you see that they are developing ways of to give value to original content, to also to on breaking news, the possibility to give value to who's arriving first, who's breaking the news first, but just with original content, not as an aggregator. There are several different key solutions that Google is finding to promote content that is coming from legacy media in a way that is different from content who's coming, for example, from aggregators. This is interesting to us. I don't see why we shouldn't discuss with Google in this way instead of just fighting against Google as an enemy. But Google is just an example. Many other digital companies are an opportunity for this.
Wilfried, I want to jump to you right now on this because I think something that Marco was just saying about how they're willing to listen to anybody who has something to say that might be of interest or help to the way that La Stampa does its job or sort of conducts its business. I get the sense that not every legacy media source takes that same attitude, and I think you can sort of that shows itself in what you were saying about Google, how there's no need to sort of be frightened of it, where the truth is that many people are tremendously frightened of Google and the like, and consider it not as something with which to partner, but an enemy that God willing will one day be destroyed or will disappear. And I'm wondering if you could just give a bit of an overview of what you've seen in your role at the European Journalism Center of how legacy media properties in Europe and beyond are sort of addressing these issues and how open they are or they aren't to change and such.
I think it's very easy to blame Google for all kinds of ailments that you have, and maybe a more general remark on the disruptiveness of the industry we're in. We have to do more with less. Yes, and we're complaining about it a lot. Yes, but if you talk to anybody from the airline industry or anybody from the gas station on the street or from the travel industry or from any other industries, they're all affected by disruptive processes. It's not just the journalists who are in this poor situation. Everybody else in any major company has pretty much similar issues with having to do less. Getting less money, having to do more work, so we're not just standalone, the poor journalists here, and everybody else is doing fine, or everybody is being disrupted, or everybody has to reinvent their business model a lot, and not just us. Having said that, with Google, it's a very simple scapegoat, I think. If you don't want to be found by Google, it's very easy to not be found by Google. The Belgian Publisher Association decided for a while that they did not want to be found by Google. I mean, what is the sense of being on the internet if you're not being found? And we all know this huge URLs. Nobody can remember. Nobody will find you if you don't do it. So we should embrace it. In Germany, there was a big discussion about the snippets. Should Google be able to use snippets to aggregate and to be found, and the newspapers made a big fuss. They wanted to be paid for the snippets Google is using, and then it is still in the parliament. It has been decided half-heartedly, and nobody really is tackling it. There's an election coming up after summer in Germany, so everybody's waiting for this election to happen first. No, it's a scapegoating exercise, I believe, and we should be happy for Google because it helps people find content. It's very simple, and if you're good, you're good. And if you don't want to be found, you can easily opt out. But what I thought was very interesting, what Marco said, that the algorithm might be changed or might be adapted to maybe not necessarily, I wouldn't subscribe to the idea of having legacy media being found better than other media, but I think we should have a look at, is the content relevant? Is it systemic? Is it of importance? Is it journalism? And if we could maybe convince Google to have a better algorithm or a higher search ranking for relevant content, for civic-oriented journalistic content, I think that would help a lot, and then we get all the noise out that there is. I mean, I think the main discussion at the core of this is this idea, what is media? Media is based on attention. Media is based on selling eyeballs, selling my attention, or the attention my story gets to third parties, to advertisers. It's a very indirect business model. I don't even know why this should be so. And I think if we look at the role of journalism, it is a more important function in society, in democracies. And I think if you look at the financial crisis, there was this idea, this whole discussion that banks were of systemic importance, too big to fail, too important to fail. And I think the same goes for journalism. Journalism is too important to fail, and it should be considered a systemic part of societies. And if Google could tweak their little algorithm a bit, that the systemic part would be found more easily, I think we would come a long way.
Let's step back from Google for a second here. And Gabriel, I want to go over to you, although if you have something to say on this topic, please feel free to weigh in. But you know what Marco was saying about the idea of a sort of contamination reminded me of something that I saw on the website of the Media Economics and Entrepreneurship Program, where I believe, and I'm paraphrasing here, on the About Us section, it said that you sort of welcome the idea of creative destruction as a force for social and economic change. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the idea of creative destruction as it relates to this search for a new business model and the sorts of things that you and your students are doing to creatively destroy so that you can build something up newer and perhaps better than what was there before.
Certainly. And so I think there's one important element to keep in mind in this conversation about the future of journalism and the future of business models. The first is on the demand side. There is more demand for news now than there has ever been before. That's partly a function of the technology, which makes news more accessible. But it's also, I think, speaks to the relevance of information in our current environment. And so I take a lot of solace in that, and I think that's actually really important. If people are consuming more news and more information, that means that there's a future for this. It's not that this product, as Willie was saying, is becoming irrelevant. It's not. It's becoming more relevant and more integral to our lives in many different ways and helping us make decisions in the right context. The problem is, of course, is that we are financing this with a business model based primarily on advertising, which will not be sustainable. And my prediction is that in the next few years, the erosion of advertising as a revenue stream for media will accelerate in a way that I don't think we're even quite prepared for. And this, let me just segue very briefly into Google. And certainly Google has many faces. We shouldn't assume that it is sort of just one entity. It works in many different respects. It helps find content. But really, I think the damage that it's done to journalism, and I think that this is inevitable, is that it has disintermediated publishers from advertising. So that is, advertising really does not need a publisher in order to reach an audience anymore. And Google and others have played a tremendous role in basically tracking, understanding behavior online, to link advertisers with eyeballs in a way that, in a value chain that does not include the publisher. However, in all of this, I think what we're seeing is that in terms of the profession of journalism, it has never been a more interesting, exhilarating time to be a journalist because of the opportunities for telling stories in new ways. This is a profession that for several centuries pretty much worked with paper and pen in some respect. And now that's been blown open, and we have the possibility of telling stories with data visualization, delivering information to people based on their location, targeting information to people by the category that they're in and how they define themselves. So really what we're seeing now is I think the most creative, most interesting moment in the creation of information, the creation of journalism that we've ever seen. The real question is, so how do we finance this? Well, one certainly important thing to keep in mind here is that just the way that the advertising world has progressed tremendously in the past 2 decades by no longer having to, and I wish somebody could hold up maybe just a regular newspaper here, use a newspaper, a daily newspaper, as sort of some blunt object to try to reach a mass geography. That just as advertisers are now able to target the people whom they feel are most relevant to them, we as journalists and publishers are able to target our audience as well. The more relevant you can make your audience, the more opportunities you can discover for financing your journalism. We have to understand journalism and news in a completely new context, in one in which by the creation, I'll oversimplify it a bit, but by creating a particular community that finds a particular piece of information relevant, we create value for that audience in a way that hasn't been explored previously.
Garrett Goodman, you've sort of worked for a bunch of places that are sort of, to me, sort of epitomize what Gabriel was just talking about how this is sort of a new, an interesting time for journalism when we're no longer tethered to paper and pen as the only way of sort of telling the stories. And please correct me if I have this wrong, but both at Citizen Side and at Worldcrunch, I believe you've experimented with a bunch of business models, none of which have anything to do with advertising. Could you talk a little bit about how Worldcrunch and Citizen Side, if you want, have, as startups in this new market, tried to come up with ways to make enough money to sustain themselves?
Sure. Okay, I'll start with Worldcrunch, and it's probably best if I just explain what we do very quickly because I don't think we're quite as well known as La Stampa, even though we work with them. So what we do is we partner with leading foreign language newspapers like La Stampa or Le Monde in France, and we surface their top stories and deliver them in English for the first time. So we have this human translation with this network of multilingual journalists. And the idea is to help breathe life back into the quality journalism that's being produced by these great papers around the world, and at the same time expose it to a new audience by actually covering the world with the local expertise, right? It's a new way to understand what's happening in the world as opposed to having the external perspective that you would get from maybe the AP or AFP or some of the wires. We're going with the local experts. And so our business model is based largely around 3 main revenue streams. We have advertising. We do have advertising. If you were to characterize our business approach, it's kind of partnering for acceleration, right? We're a small startup. We want to stay lean. We want to stay agile. We don't have this ingrained thinking, this kind of legacy media approach. So for advertising, for example, what we've done is partnered with The Economist Group. And so they're placing ads to the people who actually want to advertise on The Economist are now able to advertise on Worldcrunch. But leaving advertising aside, we also do syndication. So we take this great journalism that we've now translated into English, and we work with the New York Times, and they are now distributing our content around the world to publishers who want to get, top quality journalism from the likes of La Stampa in English. And so we've partnered with the New York Times to accelerate that as opposed to developing the whole syndication sales team ourselves. And then the third revenue stream is subscriptions. So we've just recently launched our metered paywall. And for us, I actually think it's really interesting right now in the media, there's a huge focus on the B2C aspect of the paywall, right? everybody's talking about how it's a way to get reader revenue to help kind of staunch the flow of the declining revenues from advertising. For us, it's not so much, the implementation of the paywall is not so much about actually going after the B2C market and getting individual subscribers, but more a matter of positioning our product as something premium so that then we could approach corporations and foreign embassies and universities, and we could go for the B2B offer, and we could go for bulk subscriptions to, again, accelerate, and we get one partnership that opens up thousands or hundreds of thousands of new readers as opposed to just going after one individual reader at a time. And we've seen that that works incredibly well for the FT. We just recently heard that they have over 50% of their digital subscriptions are actually paid for by companies who have bought them for the employees. So I think there's a huge opportunity on the B2B side of the paywall discussion, which isn't really being covered right now, but we're quite enthusiastic about it.
This notion of agility that you were just talking about, like the idea of being able to nimbly and quickly change course in midstream, or not be tied down to one way of doing things, but being able to bring in new ideas and sort of models as they come up. It seems to me very important in this new era in which we find ourselves, but it also seems somewhat antithetical to the way that a lot of legacy properties have worked throughout their history. And I'll start with Marco, but everyone else should feel free to chime in. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of becoming agile and able to adapt and try new things in sort of a legacy property, and sort of successes, failures, and such?
Yes, you need to jump from one platform to another very easily. This is why I was saying before that you need to move content in a way that is easy to do at a technical, but even at, I would say, cultural level. What we need is probably, a change in the culture, in the newsroom culture, from a way of thinking to our job as broadcasting to a way that is more like is possible to describe as sharing. So we have to move from broadcasting to sharing. We are no more the ones who have all the knowledge and give the knowledge to the others. We need to share that knowledge in a way that could also create some revenue, I would say. So when Gabriel was saying that we need to understand journalism and news in a complete different context, I totally agree. We have to understand how to approach our job in a way that can react quickly to all the developments. This is why, for example, we think that one of the things that legacy media could do, and newsroom in particular, could be to become also startup incubators. I mean, we are, for example, working on data journalism. We don't know, inside our newsroom, we don't have all the skills that are necessary right now to do a good data journalism, to realize a good visualization, to use all the tools and the updated tools for something that could also be beautiful on the digital side. So we are, for example, working with young people, because young here is an important word, that could give us something more, some added value, and they are not necessarily inside our newsroom. We are promoting, we are helping them to organize, for example, small companies that could be our partners in some ways. Startups, newsroom startups could be an interesting developments in the future. And on this point, even if we are talking about how to go beyond advertisement, if I can just advertise a little thing about La Stampa, we are launching a Premio Digitale, which is an award, a digital award for video makers that want to create some interesting, beautiful video contents. We will give them some money, not too much. We will give them the visibility and the opportunity to promote their video content on our platforms. You will find all the information on lastampa.it/premio digitale, so I have done some advertisement here.
So, Justin, what you mentioned about legacy media and the struggles of being agile. So, while I'm very, very excited about the future of journalism and the value that it's going to deliver, I do foresee a very bloody near-term future for legacy media for reasons that Marco mentioned, is that legacy media defines itself by the platform that it's on still. Newspapers put out a newspaper, TV shows put out a TV news show at a certain hour, radio does radio, etc. That's how we've defined it. That is no longer how people consume it. Pretty much everybody will be, if they are not doing it already, will be consuming all of this information over a browser in some way. So the notion of defining the business around a platform is antiquated, and I think creates tremendous amounts of friction and waste in terms of opportunities for revenue, because your entire ad sales force, et cetera, is organized around selling and advertising inventory into that particular platform. And in this sense, the born-to-the-web news organizations, I think, have a tremendous advantage because they don't have these legacy costs. So,
I think quite interesting what you said about the sales forces. I think in many legacy media houses, the sales guys don't really like this. We're stuck, or we're basically at the mercy being in the online space. It is very transparent. You can measure it very well. You know exactly where the audience is coming from, where they're going to, how long they stay on the page, and what they do there. In other media, you don't. Television is measured quite haphazardly, and still the advertising is going strong. In magazines, they are doing quite well in advertising, maybe because there you have more information in the ads. If I buy a magazine, let's say, on mountain biking, the advertising would all be around mountain biking, so it might be relevant to me to see new bikes and new tools and new technologies around my favorite hobby. So I think the advertising in magazines is doing pretty well. And online, we're so transparent. I worked in television for 15 years of my life. We sold a lot of advertising to advertisers, and they didn't really know how much audience we reached, was it the right kind of audience, and my sales guys would always sell the TV, and the online would be on top and for free, because the idea, it didn't really matter, and it was a new and alien approach. So I think the structural issues in-house, in the legacy media houses, the guys that need the most training is the sales guys, because they could leverage all these new properties and all the apps and all these things, but they don't know. They want to sell their old stuff. That's what they train on. That's where their margins came from. That's why they drive the biggest cars usually in the company, because they make so much money from advertising sales. But this is not going anymore. And I don't know why TV is so resilient. We measured it in Germany. It's even measured pretty properly in 30-second steps. But in the US, you have these Nielsen ratings that is kind of like guessing how many people watched your show last night. And still the advertising is doing pretty well there. So being in the online space, we're at the mercy of our own transparency in a way. And I think anybody in legacy media, I would really suggest to train your sales guys on the new platforms.
I think that's a great point, and one that is not often discussed when we're talking about business models, like just the fact that people, the ones who are selling advertising and the ones who are tasked with generating revenue for these media properties are generally people whose expertise is in medium whose time has passed. People who have lots of experience in selling print advertising and television, and they know how to do that quite well, but not quite sure how to translate those skills into the online space. And I think this ties into something that you were saying, Marco, about the sort of startup mentality in the newsroom. A defining feature of most small startups is the idea of bootstrapping, of not having a huge staff, but doing everything yourself, and becoming an expert in all facets of the business that you're trying to create. And Garrett, could you talk a little bit about that as someone who works for a small startup? What the advantages or disadvantages are of having to be so closely tied to every aspect of what you guys are trying to do?
Sure. Yeah, so I had mentioned how we try to partner for acceleration, and that's something that means that in the end we might not have direct relationships with the people who are actually buying our content, but for the moment we're at a stage in our business where we're testing out, we're revenue promiscuous. We're testing out as many different revenue streams as we can, and we're not following just a traditional media business model. So like I mentioned, syndication plays a huge part in where we see the company developing. But also I think that it's important to leverage everything you can at this stage, whether it's partnering with amazing brands that already have a global brand visibility and bringing their journalism to new platforms, or whether it's partnering with The Economist to help place advertising. I think that at this stage, you can't be scared to try new things, and we don't have those limitations, which has really opened up a bunch of new opportunities for us. We're now actually in the final stages of finishing up a pitch for Kickstarter, so we're going to start looking at crowdfunding some of our journalism as well. So yeah, it's really been an amazing journey, and I can talk about Citizen Side as well, the last startup that I worked for, where we actually started out as, it was called Scoop It, and the idea was to sell those videos of Lindsay Lohan walking out of a nightclub getting covered in paint, that scoop that no reporter's going to be on the scene to capture, that eyewitness video. And we realized that actually wasn't a viable business model because you can't count on a scoop. And how do you develop a network that's going to cover every single event that's going to happen like that? So we switched into developing more of an ongoing community of people passionate about covering the news, local eyewitnesses, we called them. And then we saw that there was another opportunity because we had built this amazing technology. We were going to then become a software as a service vendor. So we started actually licensing the technology to newsrooms so they could build their own news communities. And I think this idea of just constantly experimenting until you find the right fit is something that maybe as a startup we're lucky enough to be able to do, but I understand that there are huge limitations to that kind of thinking right now, but it's incredibly beneficial.
So how to get beyond that, those limitations when we're talking about legacy media? And this will be sort of the last general question that I ask before getting into more specifics about sort of specific models that we're working with or thinking about. This goes back to the idea of the startup in the newsroom. A lot of the tech startups that I know about, when they get started, they don't necessarily know how they're going to earn money. Where their next dollar is coming from. This is perhaps one reason why so many startups fail, but I think it's also a lesson or something interesting and instructive that these startups are forced to figure out what people want from them and to sort of adapt and evolve their conception of what they do and what people are willing to pay for. And I was hoping that maybe we could address that point generally about how important or whether that's important for sort of old media to embrace this new mentality and how difficult it is for them to do that and how to get beyond it. That's a lot of questions, but hopefully we can find something salient in that. Gabriel?
Sure. So those are some good points. And so the first thing is that in this context, we should not think of failure as something that's bad. Actually, there's tremendous amounts of knowledge that are generated by failure, and failure needs to be part of the process. But Justin, what you said about how the startups often try to then figure out what the public wants from them, I think that's very important in this discussion because part of the problem, particularly in the United States, less so in Italy and Europe, but part of the problem is that journalists and journalism organizations misunderstood what their actual business model was. They thought they were selling people news, and they weren't. In the United States, newspapers were selling people classified advertising. And they could sell people classified advertising because they had a monopoly of the market. That is, inserzioni, insomma, piccole inserzioni. That is, if you needed to, if your dog had puppies and you lived in a small town, you had one opportunity to get rid of those puppies, which was to take out a classified ad in the newspaper. Otherwise, you'd have 8 dogs pretty soon. And that's where more than half of the operating profits from newspapers came. These operating profits financed journalism and allowed these newspapers to expand. Once the monopoly was eroded with the digital distribution of news, that fell apart very quickly. But in terms of what the public actually wants, this is the key. Because now we really have the opportunity, again, to follow the lead of advertisers. Advertisers are looking for specific audiences. They want to sell diapers to people who are expecting children, not to people who are either too young to have children or in a completely different demographic. We also need to understand that our audiences will attribute value to the information if the audiences are aggregated in a particular way. That is, and I'll give you one live example, because I think that the future of the news business model, and I'll be a little contrarian here, I don't think it has much to do with actually the selling of news. And I don't think it has to do with newsrooms and large news organizations that we've seen in the past. I think the future of news is going to be much more nuanced, that news is part of an ecosystem that delivers value to particular communities. So, for example, I have a colleague at USC whose wife is a journalist, and she has diabetes. She started a website that speaks to her particular community of people who either have diabetes or live with someone who has diabetes. Those people have particular needs. They have very specific information needs. They need to ask questions of their community to get answers back. They also need real journalism around pharmaceutical drug studies, around health insurance issues, and so on and so forth. Once you've created that kind of community, those people attribute a lot of value to the kind of news that you deliver them. Yet that's not all you deliver them. You deliver them a lot of services, and you deliver them that sense of community. I think once you start to construct an ecosystem like that, news plays one role. It plays, an important role in that, but it is not a business based on selling news. It's a business based on a community, creation of a community that sees value in that type of information that's exchanged.
Let's talk about that sort of creation of a community that does see value in the information that's being exchanged, and then once that community is sort of created and invested in what you're producing, ways to leverage that into perhaps making money from that. What are we seeing in terms of efforts, successful, unsuccessful, to create that sort of community, and what can we learn from it? Marco?
I think that legacy media has always been community organizers. There has always been a point of reference in giving a value, giving information to a community, giving also all the classifieds and the advertisement that Gabriel was saying to a community. So it's not a different business that we are entering right now. It's a different way of doing the same business. We have always been community organizer. I think we still have an important task in that. I'm still talking on the legacy media side of the panel. What is necessary to me is an understanding for us as journalists about the ecosystem that he was describing. Which means that first of all, it's very important that, for example, journalists take care of business models. We haven't done that for decades because we didn't need to do that. So now we need to also take care of the revenue side of our job. It's really important for the newsroom to understand that. But we also need to understand something that is really important, which is if we think of the 5 key W's of our job, who, when, what, where, why. Did I say it right?
Great job.
Thank you, Professor. 4 of them are no more a commodity. who, when, what, where is something that is available everywhere for free, is something that we cannot have as our business model. Our business model of the future will be on why and probably on how. So we need to rethink our strategy in the newsroom on those two words, why and how, and we have to understand how we can sell that, how useful this could be to the community that we serve, in which ways we can create quality content on this. We don't have classified anymore helping us, it's true. We can try to give something different. For example, at the education level, I see a future, for example, in newsroom for masters, for the possibility of creating educational events with journalists as a protagonist, because we are expert witness that probably still have something to say.
Wilfried, what are some ways that you've seen that news properties across Europe are monetizing or attempting to monetize this why and how that Marco was just talking about, and where might they go from there?
I think what you also see in Europe, a lot of legacy media was owned by families that have been running this newspaper for 100, 150, 200 years, or for at least long stretches of time. So they would not be so affected by cyclical issues and having a bad 10 years time, because they would see over their grandchildren's shoulders kind of thing, and they would not be so rushed to make a profit in the next quarter. Of course, then when everybody sold out to corporate and private equity, they would be stuck in this business model of make a profit in the next quarter, be more profitable in the next quarter still. That ruined a lot of long-term approaches to the industry, I think. And maybe I'd like to make one more remark about the paywalls here. What we always forget is the biggest paywall we have is public television. We pay so much money for public television, and they have, in Germany, I don't even know, 9 billion euros a year to spend. And I mean, if you look at all the funding that comes from ProPublica or the Gates Foundation or all these guys, when the Europeans always feel, the Americans have all these rich families that give money to journalism, to support journalism, and the Knight Foundation and things like this. Yes, it's a great thing to have, but if you look at our public broadcasting, there's much more money there, and they just blow it on football rights, on entertainment shows, and on things like this. And if we feel this is a systemic importance, we should really address the role of public service broadcasting in Europe and say, what do we do with that money? Should it just go to these huge institutions that are partly overstaffed, I'm not saying corrupt, but like challenged at least? And I think that money should be distributed in a different manner. I think it should go to journalism, since the citizens are paying for this. And it's not. A German second channel, ZDF, has the rights to the Champions League. I mean, it's a nice thing to have, especially since we beat Spain twice yesterday and the day before. Okay, everybody loves it. But it is something that the commercial broadcasters could do just as well. There should not be public money spent on football rights and variety shows. And I think this is a huge amount of money. Every German citizen pays 30 euros a month for this. That is much more than you pay for subscription for anything. So if we could leverage that kind of money and use it for systemic and relevant journalism, I think we would come a long way and we would have a discussion. And I appreciate when you say from La Stampa, we're trying all these new things. We're trying to have an incubator, we try to enable people, we try to do new things and go into education. Why doesn't public broadcasting do this? Why don't they spend 10% of their income on supporting startups, on supporting new things that are relevant or that might be relevant? No, they're just stuck, and everybody's related to everybody else, my uncle, my niece, my nephew, and that's a messy situation. We know it from politics, and we have it in the public broadcasting too, and this is the most deplorable single fact in Europe, in my mind. Sorry to be so adamant here.
No, I would actually love to attend a panel comparing and contrasting public broadcasting in the United States with public broadcasting in Europe, because what you are describing is very different from the situation we have in America, maybe next year. Garrett, I was hoping you could address something that I just was thinking about as we were talking here. So Wilfried made the good point that in some ways online, we are victims of our own transparency online, in that we cannot hide when trying to sell advertisement or otherwise monetized content. We cannot hide behind the imprecision, this sort of the data that wasn't necessarily there about what people were or were not reacting to with print and television and whatnot. Yet Gabriel made the point that, which I think is a good one, about the importance of finding specific audiences, you know. And it seems to me that though we might not be doing it well right now, there's a big opportunity for being able to take this transparency, these analytics and stats we have online, and convert them into learning more about these sort of specific audiences and perhaps trying to build them. What are your thoughts on how to do that?
I'm going to answer your question in a second.
Okay.
But I have something that I wanted to talk about, which goes back to building community and alternative revenue streams based around that. The Economist has a really interesting events strategy. And I think events, sure, they're having sponsors get involved to help monetize the events, but they're actually running events online where they're taking 2 thought leaders in any given topic, and they're putting them in discussion, and the audience is allowed to be involved, to actually ask questions, to make comments, and it's moderated by an Economist journalist who's an authority on the topic as well. And that's a really interesting way to build community online, which is still, it's not so much that content is king in that point, as you were saying, Marco, but it's more that the brand is king. You know, now the readers are going to the brand for that expertise that they associate with it. And they're not actually producing the content in this case, but they're delivering these thought leaders, and they're fostering the community around that, and they're finding corporate sponsors to make it, you know, a profitable endeavor. They also are now hosting events in real life, and you talk about building community. What a better way than to actually connect with your readers in person, right? And now that's something that last year they made $16 million doing, just by hosting events. Their event strategy, I think, is really advanced, and it's a really interesting thing to look at when we talk about revenue streams that don't involve advertising.
How replicable is that, though? I mean, certainly the Economist is in a very sort of unique position here. How could, you know, just some random magazine that nobody likes, could they do, you know, the same thing?
Sure. So there's a startup actually called Technically Philly. They've now branched into Baltimore as well, but it's a very small outfit, and they cover tech on a very small beat. And so they've gone very niche, and they've really drilled down and defined their audience, and they're delivering that value to their audience by covering everything that's happening in the startup world in that one city. And now they are organizing events too, and a good portion of their revenue is coming from the events that they're organizing, the corporate sponsors, the small startups who want to raise their visibility amongst these key influencers in their community. So I do think that it's definitely something that can be replicated. It just has to be done intelligently. You can't, like any business decision in the media, you can't just take something that works for someone else and apply it, you know, without thinking about your market and how that will actually play out.
So I guess that's a way of answering my question, you know, about, you know, learning more about your audience and, you know, trying to serve them in, you know, a bunch of ways. So I was hoping to go down the line here and sort of get some opinions on some of the specific business models that people are trying, but we are running out of time. So instead, I'll throw the floor open to questions, and perhaps some of you can ask some of the questions that I was hoping to. We've got one right up here in the front, and I think they'll be coming around with a microphone.
I seem to have to get the mic first. Hi, I'm Jussi Pullen from Helsingin Sanomat in Helsinki, Finland, a newspaper. I just wanted to ask you about about community and some fresh piece of news. New York Times just announced a new growth strategy for the coming years in which they plan to package their content for sort of niche audiences. So I was thinking if you could reflect a bit on that and how that might be something that you can build a community on. That was something that you touched on.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's an important point. So yesterday, in fact, the New York Times announced a number of things. One, it announced that its advertising revenues have fallen much more steeply than its paywall and subscription revenue has risen. So I think that's an important point. So the other thing now, however, is Mark Thompson, the new CEO of the New York Times, really kind of announced the first major part of what I assume will be the very sharp pivot that he takes the New York Times company on. So one of these things is to really understand that the New York Times, like many news organizations, tries to do everything, right? And yet it delivers that information in a very inefficient way, okay? And I think this is kind of the big problem and big lost opportunity that a lot of news organizations are still doing. And it comes from, again, sort of a misunderstanding of the audience. The more specific the audience and the more specific the information, the more value that information has. Just to go back to the Google love fest that my colleagues here were engaging in before, one of the big things that Google did was it really commoditized news. It put everything on the same level, and news, we say in economics, everything becomes a toaster. It becomes just a commodity product, which is not distinguished. That's what news is when it is delivered sort of poorly, kind of like a sawed-off shotgun, where it just kind of goes everywhere. So what they're really trying to do is say, okay, so we have different verticals, essentially. We have people who are interested in particular issues around government, around taxation, around all sorts of different topics. And if we can package our news in that way, we can reach this audience, and all of a sudden, this news has greater value, right? And so really what they're trying to do is change their product offering to target these specific audiences in a way so that these audiences will value it more than they will if they have to dig through a 5-section print newspaper to find it. And it'll offer other opportunities for engaging with that community, which will lead to further value creation. And I think this is really what's going to be happening in the next 2 years, is that we're going to see, I think the smart publishers are going to realize that there's a lot of money that they've been leaving on the table, that they can create new products around the information that they create that are specific and targeted. And once they do that, other revenue opportunities emerge in terms of, again, offering different kinds of access to those to that community, offering other kind of services that community finds relevant. And so I think that's actually a first step. It's not going to be the ultimate solution, but it's a first step toward the new kind of creation of a news business model.
I want to hop in here too. I think that we're just getting started with this whole conversation around premium content. We have a couple of models that have been set out by some of the leaders, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff that hasn't actually taken off yet. I really like the idea of the reverse paywall. I'm not sure about the business sense behind it yet. I haven't seen a case that actually proves that, that there is a strong business model there. But in case you haven't heard of it, I think it was Jay Rosen who coined the term the reverse paywall. The idea is that you have a metered paywall, right? So you have a certain amount of content that you can consume each month, let's say. And so you use up credits every time you look at an article. And in order to actually access content once you've run out of credits, what the reverse paywall would do is reward your engagement. So the more engaged you are, the more credits you earn and the more content you can continue to consume. And engagement can be leaving comments on a blog, on an article or a blog post. It could also be tweeting out articles, so helping to diffuse the content further. And I think that is, if you're going to drive more traffic to the website, then potentially there's more advertising revenue to be made. And so maybe you don't need to have people paying for the content with money, but maybe they can pay with engagement. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a great example of really encouraging and rewarding sort of participation and investment in sort of a specific news source, and sort of trying to build a community around that. Yeah, please.
I just want to add a small experience that we have had at La Stampa. We are not the almighty New York Times, but we do something on the same direction. It's really true that you need to find also your niches. You have to find some specific content that you have that could be of value to somebody else. This is something that we have done, for example, with Vatican coverage, which is something that you do very well in Italy, and it's of value to a big audience around the world. So we have created a channel, a digital content channel on the Vatican coverage, Vatican Insider, in 3 languages, Italian, English, and Spanish. we have developed this information, and this content is more a B2B model, because you sell content to rights. You sell rights to newspapers in the world, but also you give for free information on what is going on there. And we have discovered that that was something of value that we had, also because we were also lucky, since we had a conclave recently, which is like having a Super Bowl for Vaticanists, but doesn't happen every year. I mean, it's only a few years you have had that. And we have created small revenue, extra revenue on that. For example, we have created a live blog on covering the conclave, thanks to our social media editor, Anna Masera, who is here. And we have sold rights for that coverage. It was very interesting to discover that was a request for that kind of very specific content.
Who would have thought that the Vatican would be a niche topic, actually?
It's 1.2 billion Catholics, but it's a niche.
I'm Dennis Redmond. I teach international journalism here at Perugia and work for a business council. In Rome, I'm a legacy media dinosaur, but I do work in the digital area. I want to return to the key word here, contamination. Contamination. Can you tell us what your experiences are in two areas? One, when you have niches that constantly bug you for contributions, such as RSN or Nation of Change or other type of thing, and what is the threshold of being antagonized or contributing? And secondly, another type of contamination, if you have your diabetes niches, what do you think about the influence or the infiltration of big pharma, for example? And I say that just for one or two sectors, but it can apply to all sectors. And so they can enter into the dialogue, and what is their role, and how do you keep it under surveillance?
It's a great question. Thoughts?
So let me answer the second part of that first. So one thing that's really great about communities that self-define themselves, right, is that they're very particular and very demanding, which is a good thing. So in the example that I gave before about the diabetes community that this one person created, well, certainly Big Pharma is very interested in talking to that audience, which is great. Okay, Pfizer, SmithKline, et cetera. However, that community does not want its diabetes news brought to them by Pfizer, and they know that. And therefore, in that ecosystem, you've built in an ethical component that the community really demands and values the fact that they are getting top quality, independent news and views about those topics. That still means that they've created an audience that Pfizer, et cetera, wants to reach. The community is very discerning. The diabetes community is very discerning. And that credibility, this is the other thing. Brands are incredibly important here, okay? And credibility in a world of commodity news, credibility, I think, has new value. So the whole value of that community that is created is based on the reputation of the quality of the information that's coming through it.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Marco Bardazzi?
I totally agree. Top quality independent content is, to me, is key from this point of view, because on an ethical level, if you don't give the assurance that you are not completely selling your space to big pharma, for example, that's not good business from a certain point of view, because in the community age, in the social age, it's impossible to do something like that without somebody discovering that you are actually working with somebody behind you in that kind of coverage. It's true that there are big companies willing to work closer with newsroom on content. It's really difficult to find a way of doing that without going beyond some ethical lines. An interesting example is last Olympics in London. Procter & Gamble decided to do a campaign, advertisement campaign, just as Procter & Gamble, just with their brand. Usually they use their own brands, not the main brand for that. And they decided to create stories about mothers of athletes. So what's the experience of raising a star, a sports star? And they created this content together with journalists, and you had these beautiful videos with these beautiful stories with, in the end, just a message broadcasted by Procter & Gamble. That was done together between a leading company in the world and some news organizations. What is the limit of what you could do there? There was a very interesting journalist content there, because journalists were looking for moms telling stories about their own sons and daughters and the way in which they were growing up as athletes. So that was journalism to me, but that journalism was advertised and sponsored. I mean, that was used to promote a brand. It's a limit that we have to understand better, because it's going to be there in the future more and more.
Yeah, Garrett.
Wait, I want to add on another example of when we talk about understanding the limits and having very discerning communities. There are also communities who really don't care if someone sponsors, that vertical. And I think there's one example that I have in mind in particular. It's a website called Fine Dining Lovers, and it's all branded San Pellegrino. You understand that actually it's a San Pellegrino brand portal, but they're pulling in really interesting content. They're creating their own content. They're inviting top chefs from around the world to talk about their favorite recipes, and they're providing value to this. They have 30,000 fans on Facebook. They're providing value to these people who are really enthusiastic about fine dining, and I don't think they mind that, it's sponsored by San Pellegrino. If anything, that enables them to land these interviews with top chefs.
Let's take one more question.
I'm interested in your opinion about a news published last week on Newman Journalism Lab and paidcontent.org, talking about creating community and then selling content under paywall. They said, and I ask you, what do you think about the personal brand? The packages that we talked about before could be aggregated under a single signature. I don't know, like Andrew Sullivan.
The personal brand, the idea of journalists who inspire so much sort of trust and sort of loyalty from the audiences that people are willing to subscribe to them, pay for what they do. What are some thoughts?
So that's a very good point. I recently heard this described to me as, think of the brand as the player and the publisher as the team. So from an American perspective, that's Kobe Bryant and the Lakers. I'm not totally up to date on Italian soccer, so I can't really give you an analogy there. There's going to be a lot of tension there, and there already is, right? I mean, you've got people who follow a particular publication, not because they're interested in the publication, but because they're interested in that one person. So there's two things that are happening. One is publishers are starting to wake up to the fact that they have business opportunities based around these editorial personalities, right? And that they need to monetize those. In Los Angeles, where I live, there's a food writer named Jonathan Gold, who now works for the Los Angeles Times, who has a huge following, right? There's simply no way to pay his salary by allowing him to publish one restaurant review a week. You really have to create a much broader package of content and experience for the audience in order to pay for that. At the same point, Jonathan Gold tomorrow could move to another publication and take his audience with him. So just the way you see in sports that players negotiate deals to move to a different team or a different league or something like that, you're going to see that a lot in journalism as well.
Wilfried, I noted that on the website of the European Journalism Center there was an article about a newspaper somewhere in Scandinavia, I believe, that was doing just this. It was allowing people to sort of subscribe to individual reporters. Do I have that right?
I'll be cautious here. I mean, this is, if you've been doing the job for 20 years of your life, you might be able to take this off. But I mean, most people in the audience here are young or we're starting in journalism. It will take some time and a lot of effort before you can monetize your own brand name, unless you're a genius or you're really vicious. But it's not a real, I would be very cautious here to see that as an option. It's very hard to do.
You have to be very cautious, is what she was saying.
Yeah, I think I just said, you have to be very cautious, because if you go around personalities, then all the political world can use this, and we have had in Italy the Grillo experience, just round one person saying things and winning the election. So
we are almost out of time. Before we conclude, I would like to go down the line here and ask all of the panelists to very briefly mention or just say a few words about a specific sort of revenue scheme or business model or example that they're excited about or they think is worth noting that we have not yet discussed today. And I'll start with Garrett.
Yes, thank God I'm not last. Okay, so one of the things at Worldcrunch that we're really excited about, having just implemented our paywall, is actually doing paywall partnerships, because we have quite a niche product. We do world news coverage, and we see an opportunity in partnering with the local newspapers who are providing their very niche product behind a paywall, and actually partnering up with them to offer a package of great world coverage and great local coverage. We haven't seen anybody really doing it yet, but I think it's going to happen, and we're trying to make it happen. So yeah.
Wilfried.
I think crowdsourcing might be an idea, or really asking your audience to monetize or pay up for what they like about what you do. There's a Dutch example just now. There's some journalists said, hey, we want to do a new magazine, a great magazine. Is there money to be able? And they managed to get more than €1 million in the market in a rather short space of time, because everybody trusted them and thought, hey, they might actually do something fantastic. So I think asking crowdsourcing money, I think, might be an opportunity. And I'd like to make one more remark about the contamination. I think it's a very interesting notion, because it takes us away from this linear thought of quarterly profits, growth, and this measuring it in money terms. 2 and 2 makes 4, and you have to be double next month and double the next month. If you, it's the same thing with viral and these things. We see a new world happening that is not based on linearity so much, and we're just beginning to understand this, how this goes from 2 to 8 to 700 to 2009. We don't even know how this works. Biologists know a lot about contamination and the biological processes around this. We're still very much stuck in a linear 19th century thinking there.
Gabriel Kahn.
So, one thing that I'm excited about, and I think that there are actually many things to be excited about, is the monetization of the long tail. So the news world is the only branch of media that I know that wakes up in the morning, creates a whole bunch of content, monetizes it, goes to sleep, wakes up in the morning, and does the same thing again. And yesterday's news is just that. Yesterday's news, we've forgotten about it. No one else does that. Television doesn't do that. They sell the TV rights internationally, then they syndicate them, then you see reruns. Movies then sell DVDs, and they sell the same product over and over again. News never did that. It's very stupid. That's because so much of that content that you created 2 weeks ago might suddenly be relevant again. And you need to surface that and deliver that to the people for whom it is relevant. A lot of the times what you're doing in a day's news cycle is answering people's questions about important topics. And if you can then create the system, and there's a company in Los Angeles, for example, called Perfect Market, which does this, which allows news organizations to resurface content that is created whenever, that's in their archive, and deliver it to people who need answers to those questions. And I think that that's a tremendous opportunity.
Marco Bardazzi, last but not least.
all the smart business models have already been taken, so I'm left only with the philanthropist, which is something that we don't have in Italy. I would love to have something like that, or even trusts like what they have at The Guardian. It's probably the easiest way for us, but I would suggest to somebody adopt a newsroom, because we need somebody who can give some money to this business.
If there are any eccentric billionaires out there, pay attention. We're out of time. I would like to thank my panelists from my right, Marco Bardazzi from La Stampa, Gabriel Kahn from the University of Southern California, Wilfried Ruetten from the European Journalism Center, and Garrett Goodman from Worldcrunch. I am Justin Peters of the Columbia Journalism Review. Please join me tomorrow when representatives from The Economist, the Associated Press, and several other places will join me in discussing how to get smart about social media. Thank you so much for your attention. Have a great day.
The moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore. And the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore. The moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore. And the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore.